But joining us now is Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy, we're getting fancy. Intern MJ created some elements for us, so I can actually put your story up on the screen here. The headline over at which you can find the story over Dropsite: Trump, Gaza, and Oslo deja vu. So, for people who haven't read it yet, you talk a little bit about the piece that you and Jawa put up yesterday and why it's generating so much attention.
Yeah, I mean, at Dropsite, we've been trying to interview people that are largely verboten in the broader Western media landscape. So we interview people from Hamas, we talk to people from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and we've been doing an in-depth series examining how not just Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but Palestinian political parties and factions are responding to the edicts of Trump's plan. And recently I attended a very large conference of people from throughout the Palestinian diaspora and Palestine itself, where they were discussing these various issues. And you had people from secular Marxist parties all the way to Islamic resistance parties there. And so we've been just trying to gauge kind of how different Palestinian groups are viewing this. And one thing that stands out is the remarkable sense of unity that exists across the board on a basic set of principles among Palestinian factions, including some that are historical rivals. For instance, there's a significant minority within the ruling Fatah party of Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who really want to join with all of these other Palestinian factions and reject the colonialist aspects of the Trump plan. Palestinians are not saying that they don't want an international force to come in. In fact, everyone from Hamas down to more secular, smaller parties has said, we want a force to come in under the auspices of the United Nations that can function as a barrier between the Israeli occupation forces, the genocidal army of Israel, and the Palestinians, so that we can negotiate and discuss these broader demands of the Trump plan. Palestinians are in wide agreement that they want Palestinians to be in a position to be the interim government of Gaza. They don't want Donald Trump and Tony Blair serving as the viceroys or the high commissioners, that used to exist under the British mandate. And there's also discussion about what would it look like to discuss the future armament of a Palestinian state. No Palestinian is saying, yes, we want to give up our rights to armed resistance against Israel, but they are open to a broader discussion in the context of the establishment of a Palestinian state. What has happened, and this has gotten almost no reporting, is that since July of 2024, when 14 major Palestinian political parties met in Beijing, China, including Fatah of Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, they all met and they agreed on a set of principles. This was July of 2024, and they issued something called the Beijing Declaration, which laid out a unified Palestinian position both for how to end the genocide, how to deal with Gaza after the end of the genocide, and also how to deal with the international community. And they wanted a reconstitution, a reorganization of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which since the 1970s has been recognized in the Arab world and by the international community as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But what happened is that in the 1990s, now most people have heard of the Oslo Accords, but there were a series of agreements that started with secret letters in the late 80s and went through the 1990s. Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO at the time, and Mahmoud Abbas, who now is the head of the Palestinian Authority and the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, signed a series of agreements that didn't guarantee a Palestinian state, that in fact codified a surrender of 78% of historic Palestine. We won't have it anymore. And just 22% of Palestine was supposed to have some form of limited self-governance. That's what the basic thrust of the Oslo Agreement was. This was deeply unpopular among a broad swath of Palestinian society, but it has been the law of the land, so to speak, in how Palestine has been allowed to function. And so the Palestinian Authority that Mahmoud Abbas is the president of was originally established in 1994 with a 5-year mandate. Mahmoud Abbas was elected to a 4-year term in 2005. Since then, there has not been an election. And Abbas's popularity by some polls is in single digits, others it's in the low teens. He's just kind of governed and he has full spectrum control. And so what our article, the real news in our article that really hasn't been reported in the Western press at all and isn't a major discussion yet in the broader global press, is that in the past week, Mahmoud Abbas issued an edict changing electoral law for local elections in Palestine. And many believe this is going to be cut and paste applied to national elections if they ever happen. That's part of what should happen with the Gaza plan. And what he did is he said, no candidate can run for office that does not affirm formally their support for the prior agreements made by the PLO or the quartet agreements made in the early 2000s with the United States, European Union, and others that basically say, we recognize 78% of historic Palestine is gone. We recognize the state of Israel. We renounce our right to armed resistance. That's what they're saying, that in order to do that, in order to run for office in Palestine, you have to renounce all of these things. It means that pro-resistance parties and armed resistance remains one of the single most popular points in public polling, that you are not allowed to run for public office anymore. And when you look at what the defense of this is on the part of the Palestinian Authority, it's a pathetic defense. What they're saying is, oh, we have to comply with Trump's demands because they don't want Hamas to be in the government anymore and they have to disarm Hamas. Or they say, well, if we don't do this, we're going to have international funding cut off for the Palestinian Authority or for local projects. But Ryan, it's not just Hamas that is objecting to this or Palestinian Islamic Jihad that's objecting to this. Every major human rights organization, civic organization, electoral right organization in the NGO sector in all of Palestine joined together and denounced this law and said it's fundamentally undemocratic and anti-democratic. They put it up for limited public discussion. They got inundated with people saying and groups saying, no, this is a terrible law. They ignored them and they rammed this thing through. And then this morning, one of Abbas's ambassadors.
Yeah, let me put this up here.
You can say it. He attacks me, mischaracterizes anybody who follows my reporting, the idea that I believe any of the things that he said, that I think that Mahmoud Abbas is the biggest threat to Israel. He attacks me, but doesn't say that a single thing we reported is wrong because they can't say it because it's true, because the vast majority of Palestinians are against this law. And what we did was report on that sentiment.
Yes, the rhetorical maneuvering here is interesting. Like he says, it is suspicious that everyone who does the same as you aligns with the Israeli perspective, which sees Abbas as the real danger to Israel and believes that the existence of the Palestinian National Authority is the main safety factor for the Palestinian people. They also consider the Oslo Accords, which many dislike, as the sole contractual agreement through which Israel recognized the Palestinian people and the legitimacy of their representation. After decades of denial, the Israelis want as far as to kill their own prime minister because of Oslo, talking about Yitzhak Rabin. As for Trump's plan, which no one likes, those who disapprove of it should come up with a realistic alternative, not vague slogans or outdated illusions, or remain silent and let us work in the interests of our people, whose leadership, I believe, is the most keen on its welfare. The latter part feels to me the most honest. Like he's saying, just stop talking. Like just let us do this. Like that feels like something honest slipped out. Like that does seem to be like their preference.
And that's, I mean, that basically is what they've also been saying, in their own social media or when they do comment on it in public. But there's a couple things to unpack there. I mean, first of all, person on planet Earth believes that the greatest danger facing Israel is Mahmoud Abbas. In fact, as I pointed out in my response to the ambassador, beginning in late 2024, early 2025, the Palestinian Authority security forces, many of which are trained or supported by the United States or work in collaboration with Israel, began a series of raids targeting Palestinian resistance fighters in the occupied West Bank. We reported on this at the time at Dropsite, and that then cleared the way for Israeli occupation forces to invade parts primarily of the northern refugee camps in the West Bank and engage in the single largest forced displacement campaign against Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. At every turn, Mahmoud Abbas is being used by the United States and also at times by Israel to sort of tell Palestinians, you shouldn't engage in armed resistance anymore. We need to just accept all of these deals that were made in the 1990s. And by the way, Mahmoud Abbas himself personally signed parts of the Oslo Accords at the White House in 1993. So he's been doing this his entire career. This man has not faced an election since 2005. He's facing down even people within his own party, significant voices in his own party, saying that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, is no longer representative of the will of the Palestinian people. He's acting in servitude to Trump's plan while paying some lip service of criticism to what many Palestinians are saying. And at the end of the day, he's ignoring the fact that Palestinian factions have been meeting for almost 2 years and laying out their own vision for how they want to proceed going forward. So, there's a very dire situation happening when it comes to who speaks for the Palestinians. And Hamas remains the single most popular political party. But as we've said many times, if there were elections tomorrow in all of Palestine, the most popular candidate, according to all public polling, is Marwan Barghouti, who is from Abbas's party originally. He's from Fatah. But Hamas and the Palestinian resistance have been trying to get him freed in these exchange deals. He represents a grave threat to Mahmoud Abbas and to Israel because Israel, is very content to have Mahmoud Abbas there. Israel doesn't want Gaza and the West Bank to be unified under a common government. We explain in our story how in 2017, Yahya Sinwar, who had just been elected the head of Hamas's political bureau, tried to broker a deal with Mahmoud Abbas for the Palestinian Authority to actually return to Gaza and take power in Gaza. And Mahmoud Abbas ultimately rejected that deal. And some of the people we interviewed said, if the PA had done that, and of course they didn't do it because the US and Israel didn't want them to. Israel does not want Palestinians to have a unified government over Gaza and the West Bank. They want it to be divided. And Ryan, that famous quote that a lot of people misinterpret, and it's every single day you see it. When Netanyahu said it during this attempt at reconciliation, or right after he had thwarted it. He said, anyone who wants to thwart the existence of a Palestinian state has to keep the money flowing to Hamas. People are like, oh, this is evidence that Netanyahu supports Hamas. What Netanyahu was saying was something insidious. He was saying, we need to divide and conquer. He was talking about a situation where the Palestinian Authority had worked with Israel to cut off electricity to Gaza, where the Palestinian Authority was refusing to go back in and unify the governments in Ramallah and in Gaza as one. And Netanyahu was claiming victory and saying the best way to prevent the Palestinian state is to divide Gaza and the West Bank. It wasn't about funding Hamas as a political organization. It was saying, give them enough money so that they barely can function, and then keep Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority from reaching any agreement that would unify Palestine. I think it's really important for us to talk about the nuance of this because it's exactly what they're doing right now. It's a redux of Oslo mixed in with the divide and conquer strategy, create cantons or little Bantustans around Gaza. Maybe they're going to split it in half. The Israelis are in control of more than 50% right now, and they're saying they're going to build a green zone and try to entice Palestinians to come over. They're also drawing a line through the West Bank and trying to divide it. There's talk of even trying to deport 1 million Palestinians from the West Bank, saying they're actually really Jordanian citizens. Smotrich has talked about this. So all of these things are happening. The U.S. doesn't like Mahmoud Abbas. Israel doesn't like Mahmoud Abbas, but not for the reasons Palestinians don't like him. They view him and the Palestinian Authority as even too much Palestinianism on the scene. They don't actually want Palestinians at all. So it's like, even though Abbas has spent his career in servitude, even though the sycophancy is off the charts, you still have Trump sanctioning Abbas. You still have them sanctioning PA officials. You still have them accusing them of supporting terrorism, even though Abbas canceled the payments to the families of prisoners or martyrs who died resisting or were imprisoned resisting Israel. So no matter what he does for them, and this is really indicative of how deep this Zionist sort of supremacy runs, no matter how much servitude Abbas engages in, no matter how weak and decrepit the PA is, it's still too Palestinian for the Israelis. So, there's a reason why Trump and those guys don't want to talk to Dr. Mustafa Barghouti. Jeremy?
We just lost Jeremy. We'll see if he. Oh, you're back.
Sorry.
So
Just to close it, there's a reason they don't want to talk to all. The bottom line, what people should know is there's unprecedented unity across the political spectrum in Palestine right now. And Abbas is collaborating with the Americans and the Israelis, and they're very happy to have him there in a sense, because they can use him as a veneer of legitimacy, but they don't even want Abbas himself to be in charge because he's Palestinian.
And you have a key detail about the Beijing Declaration that I think is interesting. So could you give a little context to, and let's think about the particularly July of 2024, but more generally the spring and summer of 2024 as both a turning point and a potential hinge point in the genocide, but also a hinge point when it comes to Palestinian unity, because as you write about in the piece, Abbas, Fatah signs on to this declaration, which is a significant threat then to actually create a unified political structure. Immediately reneges on it when he comes back, when he returns. But so let's remind people like what's going on, kind of militarily and politically, in the summer of 2024. And reminder to anybody who needs it, the Biden administration is in power at this.
So you have Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in the White House. Antony Blinken is basically running the U.S. strategy behind the scenes. In May of 2024, it seemed clear that the Palestinian side was going to make some concessions and agree to another ceasefire deal. In fact, many of the terms were identical to the one that then goes into effect in January of 2025.
And the Biden team has claimed credit for the January 2025 deal, saying this is the same terms that we had in place in May. So that part is true. They just didn't get the deal.
It's true, but Trump, even before he was in office, used the substantial powers of the office of the American president to ensure that the Israelis were going to accept that deal. And of course, he then allowed them to blow it up and to continue the genocide. But it's actually a damning indictment. If I were a Biden administration official, I wouldn't be running around making that point, because
it's not making the argument you think it is.
I mean, to say, oh, well, we created a reasonable framework that then was adopted in January. Well, why wasn't it? It was because, and now Biden people are on record as saying this openly in interviews, that they didn't want to pressure Israel too hard in fear that it would blow up a ceasefire deal, that Israel was sabotaging. I mean, it's still, it's great that they are saying this openly. So you had this on July 2nd, Hamas, and we broke this story. Hamas signed a declaration that it delivered to the mediators saying we accept these terms based on American amendments that Blinken had told the mediators will get Israel on board with this. Israel then turns around, as it always does, and says, no, there has to be new terms now. So in the midst of this, you had some of the heaviest bombing. You had intense forced displacement operations. This sort of matrix system was being unfurled, where Palestinians were being pushed into ever shrinking kill cages. And then you had all of these Palestinian factions gather, and they signed a rather lengthy document that not only was putting forward conditions that were very much in line with what the world, including the United States, was saying were necessary for a ceasefire and exchange of captives deal, but also addressing every possible question about what happens after a ceasefire becomes permanent and we have to contend with reconstruction and governance. And they talked about forming interim bodies that would be run by Palestinians to ensure that the democratic will of the Palestinian people was at the center of any response that would be given that had to do with their own future. And an agreement that they would reform the Palestine Liberation Organization so that it truly could serve, and it would mean that it was the actual sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Abbas didn't attack it when it happened. His party agreed to it. What happened is that he paid lip service to saying it's great when we have, Palestinian unity, but then he turns around and he implements policies that run in the total opposite direction. And he himself is denouncing Hamas and feeding into the demonization narrative. And so you had this moment in time where if you had a president in the United States that had real political will, that wasn't an ideological Zionist, that actually was interested in creating a better reality for Palestinians, they could have made a deal that would have had the democratic support of all Palestinians, and every issue would have been on the table. And instead, the U.S. under Biden allows Israel to blow up that deal. The scorched earth bombing goes on again. Trump comes into office. They impose this ceasefire. It lasts through one phase. The Israelis unilaterally abandon it. They begin their terror bombings again. And then you didn't have an agreement take place then until October. And the Palestinians only agreed to negotiate on the terms of ending the acute war, exchange of captives, the resumption of military aid, and an initial framework for Israeli withdrawal. Everything else in Trump's plan, which is a neo-colonialist plan, they said has to be handled according to the principles of Beijing with a wider cross-section of Palestinian society. And so what the US is doing right now, and actually Emmanuel Macron is deeply involved with this. France is working with Abbas to write a new Palestinian constitution. And he's been caught on tape talking about this with Abbas on sort of hidden camera pickup. No Palestinians have been shown a draft constitution, but Emmanuel Macron has. No Palestinians were shown the actual final text of this law, anti-democratic law on elections, but France saw it first. So the US, the EU are in this conspiracy with Mahmoud Abbas to strip the Palestinians of a democratic voice and to ultimately serve as the facade, the window dressing for a Palestinization of Trump's day after plan in Gaza. And most Palestinian groups, with the exception of Abbas's clique, are saying, we reject colonialism from the time of the British to the present.
I think there was some hope at the time of this summer, and based on the fact that Beijing had hosted this summit, that perhaps they were going to get more involved and become an actual...
China, you mean?
Oh, yes. Yeah, China. Yeah. That China would get involved and become an actual neutral mediator. Like that, the thing that has been... There's no such thing as a neutral mediator when you're talking about a country. Like all countries have their own interests. So two questions on that front. Do you think that Beijing's involvement, China's involvement, actually kind of hardened U.S. resistance to some type of a ceasefire? Because they say, wait a minute, we'd rather see this destruction and this calamity continue rather than see China actually get something useful out of this for their own purposes. And it raised a lot of hopes at the time that China might actually get more involved, and that could lead to a peaceful resolution. What did you hear at the conference from Palestinians about those hopes, which seem to have been dashed so far, as they've been like, you know what, forget it?
I was speaking to Palestinians at this conference right on the eve of the UN Security Council resolution on November 17th, which was a shocking, unprecedented move, embracing and legitimizing or seeking to put a stamp of legitimacy on Trump's Gaza plan, including the deployment of a force, an armed force that would not actually be under the command of the UN, but under the command of Trump's so-called port of peace that Trump is the chair of. And there was some, I think, cautious optimism that either China or Russia would veto that, in part because all of the resolutions that Russia and China supported for the 2 years of the genocide leading up to this, that would have implemented a ceasefire, the US vetoed them. And China and Russia circulated an alternative draft, but then they quickly withdrew it and they both abstained and they allowed it to go forward. I do think that in a broader geopolitical sense, the US at that moment in the summer of 2024 was concerned because China was also engaged in other diplomacy and negotiating other peace agreements involving Saudi Arabia and Iran, and was wielding its soft power in a way that, you know, hawkish people within both the Democratic and Republican parties find deeply concerning. You know, China is able to extend its influence without having to deploy large amounts of military force. They operate through economic and other means, and because they largely stay out of trying to dictate the internal affairs of the countries that they want to do business or extract natural resources in. You know, they have a cold, calculated way of looking at the world. But I don't think that was the defining factor. I think the defining factor was Israel, that Israel was in control of whether there was going to be a ceasefire or not, and Biden's people just refused to ever push it through. So, yeah, I think there were some concerns about China, but I don't think the fact that the Palestinian factions happened to have signed this in China, or that the Chinese foreign minister brokered this in a formal capacity, was the key factor. Ryan, I know we only have a couple minutes left to talk about this before Sammy comes on, but there is something I want to bring up, and that is that there has been very little reporting in the US media or in the world media about these Palestinian fighters that are trapped in tunnels in areas that are currently under Israeli control. This is a huge issue for Palestinians that everyone is paying attention to on a daily basis. There are fighters from Qassam brigades or other armed forces that are stuck in these areas. And Israel has been trying to manufacture its own victory moment. They want them to come out and wave a white flag. They want to snatch them and take them as prisoners of war. And they've been systematically murdering these men in tunnels. Israel claims they've killed more than 40 of them. Some videos have been put out in an attempt to try to humiliate them.
How many do people suspect there may be?
At the beginning, there was an estimate. It's hard to know. There was an estimate that there are a couple hundred of them. And remember, a ceasefire is not Israel makes an agreement not to murder civilians. It's Israel signed a ceasefire agreement with the armed combatants in this war. That means they signed a ceasefire deal with Hamas, whose armed wing is the Qassam brigades. They signed a ceasefire deal that encompassed all of the Palestinian resistance. And so what they're doing is they are murdering in an extrajudicial manner the armed forces of a party that they have signed a ceasefire agreement with. And I want to point out one thing about this too. Ghazi Hamad, who is on the Palestinian negotiating delegation, he's a senior Hamas official. He was one of the people that was targeted in that assassination strike in Doha. We learned this week that his son was one of the Palestinian fighters that was killed this week by Israel, attacking these men, even though there's a ceasefire. Bassem Naim's son, who's another senior Hamas official, was killed a few weeks ago. The second son of his, who was in the Qassam brigades, that was killed. Dr. Khalil al-Hayya, who is the political leader of Hamas in Gaza, his son was killed in that Israeli assassination strike in Doha. Other sons of his have been killed. I'm bringing this up because the way that the Israelis talk about Hamas's leadership is that they live in five-star hotels and that they are enjoying the high life while their own people are being killed. But if you contrast the fact that these Hamas officials, in fact, I don't know a single Hamas official, and I've interviewed many of them, that hasn't had a direct family member killed, and most of them have sons who are enlisted in the resistance fighting against Israel. Contrast that with Netanyahu's son, who's living the party boy life, in Miami, or Trump's son, or the sons of all of these powerful people. People could say whatever they want. You could have debates about political leaders of any movement, but this is a story that isn't getting attention. These are people whose own sons are in these resistance movements while they're negotiating. So one of the Palestinian negotiators who could have probably intervened to get his own son out in some form of a negotiation, that's not what happened. What happened is that their children are dying like those of everyone else in Palestine.
And to underline your point, in a ceasefire, it's just it should not, we should not allow it to be not shocking. Like,
you can't say, if you sign a ceasefire and you say, but they're Qassam brigades. No, you signed a ceasefire.
Who you signed the ceasefire with.
That's not how ceasefires work. But I feel like I'm losing my mind on that one point, because people are saying, oh, but they're terrorists, or oh, but they're Qassam brigades. The ceasefire was signed with Hamas. That's their armed wing. You can't then say we still have a right to murder these people because they're in the Qassam brigades, because that's who you signed the ceasefire agreement with. So this is a huge story that every Palestinian is paying attention to, and most of the rest of the world is not paying any attention to it whatsoever. It is a massive crime that is taking place. This is extrajudicial murder of an armed force that is under a ceasefire agreement.